Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burak of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest, but I've been friends with him for a while now, and I think he's really cool. He has a very interesting story. He's been on the Tom Woods Show, the podcast, multiple times, talking about his experiences escaping Venezuela. He still has family members there, escaping the socialism and collapse in Venezuela. He's also a writer for the Mises Institute and for Gunpowder Magazine. José Niño, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure.
So, José, before we talk about your specific experiences and your family members and some of the crazy details that some of us have either heard or read about going on in Venezuela, either now or in the last couple of years, and how like the Western society, whether it's the US, the United Kingdom, Western Europe, are all kind of embracing socialism with what we're seeing with the surveys out there from young people who are more in favor of socialism than capitalism. Let's just kind of look at a 30,000 foot view of socialism. So the definition, I think the economic definition of socialism, it used to be that they wanted to control the means of production, right? And then that would allow the workers, the proletariat, to have a better lifestyle, move up and have equality. And then that would be part of what this overall revolution. So there would be some type of eventual utopia for communism.
Yes, that's how the original definition used to be, where there was a strong emphasis of the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But as time went on and it became very clear that socialism was very destructive, these countries like the Soviet Union, North Korea, Vietnam, and even present-day Venezuela, once they embraced these policies, it destroyed the productive capacities of these countries, caused massive shortages, millions of people dead, just complete turmoil. A lot of socialists and their ilk started pivoting towards different strategies and different political goals, such as cultural Marxism, for example, which really emphasizes the idea that like minorities, women, LGBTQ are like these oppressed groups and straight white males are the enemy. So they would use like different categories, but still use the same means of state coercion. When you look at socialism and its many variants and cousins, like say fascism, national socialism, communism, anarcho-syndicalism, whatever, these philosophies all have some commonalities in that the state is the ultimate arbiter of economic affairs. You don't have control of your property. Your property is either controlled by the state directly, it could be redistributed by the state through legislative fiat or by a dictator's whim, or your property can be regulated out of existence by some bureaucrat in a far-off land like in Washington, D.C., or in a globalist fortress in Brussels. So you definitely see a lot of variations, but ultimately all these strains of socialism go back to like one central theme, and it's control.
Yes, it's one of those versions of totalitarian government. So whether it's fascism, whether it's national socialism, whether it's, global international socialism, which is what the Soviets wanted, there's a lot of similarities there. Now, the mainstream socialists, they'll talk about there's not similarities there. A lot of the regular people in the mainstream will dispute that. But as libertarians who study totalitarian government, there's a lot more similarities there than people would care to admit. So you talked about the Soviet Union. I think the socialists, in reality, socialism has an absolutely horrible track record, okay? And the people that embrace socialism still, the only way that they can sell this is they have to totally ignore it. I think Ludwig von Mises even wrote an entire book, first of all, on socialism, and he explained the economic calculation problem and how socialists basically have to use prices from the West. The Soviet Union would have collapsed a lot sooner had it not had Western prices to help it. But the Soviets took the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, all the Lenins, the Stalinists, etc., all took control of the means of production. So they produced consumer goods, but they were horrible. They didn't produce them right. No one wanted them. No one wanted Soviet cars. No one wanted Soviet shoes. I think the only consumer product, Jose, that's left over from the Soviet Union that's actually successfully exported to other countries is Stolchnaya vodka.
Yes, that's correct in that Mises was ahead of the curve in identifying socialism and all of its statist cousins, in that it's a religion in the sense that there's no objective evidence that these type of policies are actually conducive to economic growth. They completely violate economic common sense. I think one of the largest contributions Ludwig von Mises made to economic thought was his understanding of how prices worked as signals in the market. And one of the hallmarks of like pretty much all systems are price controls. And price controls, they're in full effect in Venezuela. They're the reason why Venezuela has concert level lines of people waiting to get basic goods like flour, sugar, or even toilet paper. So, yes, it's definitely based on religious assumptions with no basis in reality. And like you said, Jason, you have to ignore the blatant examples like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Vietnam, and present day Venezuela to continue peddling this. But that's the thing. It is very culturally accepted in a lot of segments of society in the West. And unfortunately, and in an ironic twist of fate, a lot of corporate entities have gone into the mix and have piggybacked off of a lot of these cultural Marxist trends. And if you look at the history of socialism, it has required some degree of capital to remain somewhat functional. And it also just makes sense because socialism kills the proverbial goose that lays the golden egg of capitalism. So there's always that tightrope a lot of socialist governments have had to walk. And a lot of the business interests that join in on this, it's simple why they'll join in. It's because socialism provides concentrated power and shelters a lot of corporate interests from free market competition. Decentralization is like the enemy of any aspiring politician, rent-seeking entrepreneur, or politically connected businessman.
And the amount of propaganda that a lot of the socialists, like either academics or even people that make money in the private sector but still believe in socialism. I mean, look at all these technology executives. I don't know if you've seen some of these pictures going around Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat, but there's like people making very big dollar amounts at Google and Facebook and Twitter and all the big tech social media companies, and they're wearing communist shirts while they're collecting, 6 or 7 or 8-figure paychecks.
Yeah, it's a cultural problem at the end of the day. And once a culture embraces socialism, the politics is going to eventually adopt it as well, since pretty much all politics is downstream from culture. And it's actually pretty scary because, and also somewhat ironic because of the fact that all these socialists, they talk about how they're anti-fascist and are always screaming about fascism. But when you see corporations like using state privilege to consolidate their hold in the market and conduct their affairs in the market, that's the textbook definition of fascism. It's a public-private partnership between the state and the private sector, where the state picks winners and losers, and corporations just jockey for political power rather than serving the needs and wants of their consumers. And it's a kind of ironic twist of fate. In many ways, people become what they fight, and that's what socialism has engendered.
So very good points. I can tell you firsthand experience that YouTube is techno-fascist. I think the new phrase is techno-fascism. So the technology tools with censorship algorithms, they don't even need that many human beings to do it anymore. because they can have computer programmers from the bosses up ahead. The bosses up ahead have certain political views like, hey, we're going to make sure these candidates in the next election don't get buzz on social media. And they could basically make it now on Twitter. There's all these different types of censorship filters where you don't see your posts. I mean, you don't see your tweets. Hardly anyone sees your tweets, even people who follow you. So if you have a large Twitter following and you put out tweets, people might not even see them. But the propaganda, Jose, has gotten so crazy. I sent you this, I think it was earlier this year, much earlier this year. There was a piece of propaganda, I think it was the United Kingdom Socialist Party put out, and they were trying to claim that Venezuela and North Korea are state capitalism, that those two countries are failures of capitalism, that socialism doesn't deserve any blame. They literally put out like a propaganda chart, and I think it had over 10,000 retweets or something.
Yeah, that's just the sad state of affairs we're in. It's infected a lot of the political discussion and cultural discussion in the West. I think it's much worse in Europe because Europe, since World War II, has definitely embraced social democracy and socialist light types of economic organizations. So they're much more accustomed to this, and they're spreading these types of tropes and memes without any repercussions because it's very much in vogue with corporate elites. And that's actually probably one of the more ingenious moves that a lot of leftists have made over the past 30 to 40 years. Instead of trying to always fight against the corporate elites, they merge together and essentially convince them. And it's a move that could pay dividends for them because these corporations are the lifeblood of a lot of the tech economy, and also for a lot of businesses like social media presence. You're practically non-existent these days, so they exercise a lot of leverage. And to comment on your point about YouTube, it's actually interesting because I do some side work in some of the fitness and dieting niches. And I've talked to a lot of YouTube creators that are now focusing more stuff on email marketing and back-end marketing because the YouTube algorithms, the demonetizations, and the 2017 adpocalypse has changed the whole game for many content creators that hold controversial views and stuff like that. Some have had to essentially either scale back the frequency of their content or sometimes exit the whole platform and focus on their actual business itself. So it's starting to hit all sectors of the economy. And it's a sad state of affairs that we live in because a lot of these companies, they offer legitimate services, voluntary services on the market. Unfortunately, our society has just become too politicized, and it's created a negative feedback loop with our politics and culture.
So do you think what's the free market solution then to these big tech companies? Because it seems that there's Republicans actually, like pro-Trump people, actually calling for these companies to be regulated like utilities. As someone who's libertarian and free market, I don't want to see that, but I also acknowledge that what these big technology companies are doing is not really something that should happen in a free market because there's no competition. They have patents on all these, and they have such enormous resources that they can literally buy up all the competition or buy lobbyists to protect them.
Yeah, I believe the concerns a lot of these right-wingers have are actually valid. And in fact, I think to scoff at them like some libertarian organizations have done is not a good look. And frankly, we live in I think as Robert Higgs said it best, we live in a participatory fascist economy, which has a facade of capitalism, but there's an underlying structure of government intervention and extortion in the background that most people don't see. And I think that if you have the government step in to regulate these companies, I think it'll create a whole set of unintended consequences. And frankly, I just can't envision somebody like Gavin McInnes or Alex Jones winning a court settlement and some type of regulatory dispute of like fair use in the future against a government or something like that. I feel, or a company for that matter, because I feel like the state and the culture surrounding the state is just really anti dissent when it comes to the globalism versus nationalism debates or authoritarianism versus libertarianism debates. I think that we have to look at culture, and that's why it's important that that as like libertarians, we set the tone that yes, these companies do have the right to disassociate and pick and choose who they do business with, but as consumers, we also have the right to criticize publicly, humiliate them, and if we have the know-how, build our own platforms. And there are platforms being built, but it's not an easy process by any means. That's why like the typical response of go build it yourself is kind of shallow. And while technically correct, it's difficult. And these companies do enjoy really powerful network effects. So it is going to be difficult to pry people off. But I think, like I said, you have to change the culture, and then we also have to mount political movements that can ultimately repeal a lot of the government privileges these companies have and start changing the conversation. Definitely not an easy topic to handle, though.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems is, and one of the reasons why they're so protected, is their patents. So they basically buy all this intellectual property. Either they develop it themselves or they buy it. And then it's really hard to compete. And then you have competing companies. In the example of YouTube, you have a company like BitChute, which is starting to gain some traction. And then all of a sudden, and I think probably Google or Alphabet or YouTube or Don't Be Evil or whatever the hell you want to call them, they went to their friends, because in Silicon Valley, everyone's pretty close. They went to their friends at PayPal and they got BitChute's payment processing blocked by PayPal. So, I mean, like your example here, BitChute's trying to compete and help the people out who've been censored and demonetized or deplatformed, or, you know, all these different things that can happen to you. And you have these tech companies, you know, in cahoots with each other. That this is not really free market forces.
It's not. It's very political, and it might not be directly political, but it's the politics is there. You've seen like the politicization of people's mindsets and culture, and yeah, culture and politics definitely feed off of each other. My only concern is that if more state intervention emerges, I think it's just going to create a whole set of problems. I do think that there needs to be a debate on these policies. Like these companies need to be transparent. They need to be called out. They should never be praised. I've seen some so-called free market organizations actually praise the removal of Alex Jones, which I think is nuts because Alex Jones, say what you want about him, he's gotten a lot of people over into the Liberty fold, and this the coordinated censorship of his was a pretty worrisome event. And I think that as time goes on, there will probably emerge something. It might not be BitChute, but that could give these companies a run for their money because I think there is a breaking point where you mix politics too much in business. I think that the human story is one of innovation and creativity. And I am somewhat optimistic in the long term that there could be an alternative. But in the mid to short term, I believe that we need to just start changing the culture and start telling people, like, this is what's going on here. This is a politicized industry that is using a lot of collusion between politically connected actors and other corporations to shut out dissent.
Amen. And, you know, the people, the either pro-Trump people or Republicans or even some libertarians who are saying, you know, great job, Twitter and Google and Facebook, you know, coordinated effort with the email company, the payment processors getting rid of Alex Jones. They're stupidly and incorrectly thinking that it's going to stop just at Alex Jones. It's not going to stop at just Alex Jones.
Yes, that's correct. They're going to go after more people. It's a boiling frog effect because that's actually, I'd say, it's a microcosm of what goes down politically. I think that's one of the geniuses of like the Western collectivist model. They've learned from the Soviet Union, from North Korea and stuff, that if you boil the frog too quick, it'll just jump out. But if you slowly condition the populace into believing that like this stuff is acceptable. First, you start out with the fringe people. You go with Alex Jones, then or like Milo. Then you move on to like guys like Gavin McInnes, and then you move on to insert X conservative or libertarian figure. It's a gradualist process, and frankly, say what you want, politics functions these days as a slippery slope. The interventionist models that Mises has been talking about for decades, his stuff is coming into reality. He was ahead of the curve in predicting it. You're seeing it in the culture already, in the corporate culture. And I like to tell people that if you see if people in the boardroom are getting down with socialist causes, it's coming to your legislature soon. It's not just going to be confined to the private sector.
And it's actually starting at a younger age. So I don't know how much you've researched about this, Jose, but I've been researching this for the last few years now. So like the Fabian socialists, Antonio Gramsci, they were the ones who were saying we have to start the brainwashing. We have to take control of government schools. We have to get control of the media. We have to get our message across that, capitalism is bad. Profits are bad. We have to divide and conquer people through like race, class, age, gender, all these different things. And if you look, I was surprised to learn this. I researched this a couple years ago, that like a lot of the goals of the United States Communist Party from like the 1950s, they've already been accomplished.
Yes, this is a really interesting point you raise, Jason, that a lot of these trends have been in place for a while. I think that whenever you see a lot of the novice political activists and commentators that are just getting their feet wet get caught off guard by these developments, I tell them that to really hit the books hard, read like the history, read stuff by like Anthony Sutton, Tom Woods, the communists themselves, to understand that this stuff has been going on for a long time, and it's starting to just manifest itself because it's picked up enough cultural momentum. It's part of their plan. A lot of these socialist groups, they studied the failures of their ideologies. They recognize it. It's just that they want, what they want is control, so they have to like get like kind of tricky and creative with the methods they use, but the cultural Marxist method has generally worked pretty well because you see a lot of people engaging in all these debates about white privilege, gender privilege, and the corporations have bought it hook, line, and sinker. And it's pretty scary because they're achieving a lot that even the old communists couldn't do. And yeah, it's just like it's the same system but with different cosmetics and strategies. But I think the end game is always going to result in some type of oligarchical collectivist system of the politically haves and the politically suppressed have-nots.
So let's transition now, Jose, to Venezuela. So I've listened to your interviews from Tom Woods, and I think an important point that our listeners might not be aware of that you demonstrated a lot in your interviews is that Hugo Chavez, Maduro, this is just like the end game of all the corruption, of all, the full takeover of government and socialism. Not only has there been enormous amounts of redistribution of wealth in Venezuela, especially to like the cronies, the theft. There's also been, stealing of the means of production too with the oil company and other things. So when did all this start then in Venezuela?
The Venezuelan process is really a story of decades in the making. Um, Well, Venezuela historically has been a very impoverished country until it discovered oil in the mid 19 teens. And from that point on, up until the 1960s, Venezuela became like one of the most prosperous countries in the region and also in the world as well. It was ranked in the top 10. But in the same time period, you saw like the worldwide growth of socialism, and these ideas started to gain a lot of traction in Venezuela as well. And 1958 was a rather important year in Venezuela because that was when the country reverted back to democracy, where they toppled a military dictator by the name of Marcos Perez Jimenez. And the leaders of this resistance movement were actually a lot of social democrats, some of them even ex communists that kind of saw the errors of their way, but they still believe kind of like in the same ends of communism. They just wanted to tweak the means. So from 1958 until 1998, Venezuela started to gradually become like more interventionist in its economic policy. The 1970s were a turning point because that's when the Venezuelan government nationalized its oil industry, and now the government had its own like piggy bank that it could use from petroleum revenues to buy off voters through welfare programs, inefficient infrastructure programs, and just engage in a lot of redistributionist politics. And one thing that actually made Venezuela rather exceptional compared to a lot of oil countries before its oil nationalization was that it was a laggard when it came to the oil nationalization. Most countries started nationalizing their oil in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. It took Venezuela until like the 1970s. But once the oil was nationalized, the Venezuelan government just dialed up the interventionism like no other. It nationalized other industries like the iron industry. It started subsidizing corporations. Actually, the Venezuelan government also bought a majority stake in Venezuela's central bank and essentially politicized it. And one fun fact that a lot of people don't know about Venezuela is that it hasn't had single digit inflation since, I believe, 1983. So Venezuelan millennials have never seen an inflation rate of less than 10%. So the country was starting to get in bad shape in the 1980s, and it was debt ridden, big spending across the board. It was starting to become very anti competitive of the global market. And you had one president, ironically, the Carlos Andres Perez, the guy who nationalized the industry, who came back into the scene in the early 90s that tried to um, deregulate the Venezuelan economy with the help of the IMF. He got some decent measures in, like tariff reductions, some subsidy cuts here and there, but he never addressed any underlying problems like the central bank. For example, they never tamed inflation, nor did they even really try to genuinely privatize the state owned oil industry. And also, his party, which was a social democrat party, hated his reforms, and they played a very big role in ultimately impeaching him in 1993. But in this time period is when an upstart lieutenant colonel by the name of Hugo Chavez became very prominent and uh, just started to build a movement against this entire system. He launched two failed coups in '92 that ultimately got him jailed, but he eventually got pardoned in '95. And from that point forward, the entire Venezuelan political system was like in shambles. The bipartisan system of 1958 to 1998 lost pretty much all credibility. And around that time is when my family actually moved to the States. We moved right before things really got heated when Hugo Chavez came into power because we saw the tea leaves there. There was already two coups. There was already inflation that was going up to 50% on on certain years, and the Venezuelan populace was slowly getting poorer. One fun fact that a lot of people don't realize was that the average Venezuelan in 1998, the year Hugo Chavez got elected, was poorer than the average Venezuelan in 1958 on a per capita GDP basis. So Hugo Chavez had a very easy target to attack throughout his campaign. Like, his campaigning was already done for him. Your country was poor because of your socialist-like policies. But tragically, he doubled down and introduced very tyrannical elements to his administration that took Venezuela even further down the road to serfdom.
Yeah, my family actually escaped the Soviet. Well, before the Soviet Union, we saw the tea leaves too before the Bolshevik Revolution. So we got out of Russia and the Ukraine before the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yes, a lot of these stories have a lot of commonalities in that you see it repeating over and over again. Unfortunately, history departments don't talk about this; they gloss over it. And I actually think Venezuela proves a lot of Mises's theories when he was talking about how the West's gradualist adoption of Fabian-style socialism will ultimately die out and kill the system altogether, because like eventually these interventions accumulate. A lot of capital is destroyed, and there comes a point where certain generations just wake up more capitally impoverished further down the line. I actually think Venezuela proves a lot of Mises' theories and warnings to a T.
Well, I hope I'm wrong about this, but unfortunately, Jose, here in the United States and Western Europe and the United Kingdom, it looks like things are going to get worse before they get better, because there's a lot of people, unfortunately, that are blaming capitalism for everything bad in society right now. I hear it all the time. I even hear it on dating apps. I hear women lecture me that, oh, you're in business, oh, you're in finance, oh, capitalism is the root of all evil. Capitalism is what's causing all the problems in society. I mean, I hear this repeated verbatim. Meanwhile, Jose, a lot of people, even people with 2 or 3 degrees, they can't even give you a definition of what capitalism is, a proper one.
Yeah, that's the state of affairs in any publicly run institution or private university that's been infected by socialist culture and politics. It's it's very concerning for the West, I think, because the West, what separated from the rest of like civilization, the rest of like Eastern civilization and other more backwards cultures, is the fact that it respects property rights, it respects the idea of free enterprise, the rule of law, and like meritocracy. But now that's all going down the drain thanks to years of indoctrination.
And also free speech too, Jose,
Yep.
because in you can talk more about this than me, but I've read cases where there's a political leader in Venezuela gaining power, right, that's rising up against Hugo Chavez or Maduro, and a couple months later the guy disappears. They never find his body or something. And free speech is a staple of that. So not only do you have private property rights, rule of law, freedom of speech, Second Amendment, those things are all like the cornerstone, the main amendments. And so those things they're not eliminated immediately, but it's getting to the point where they've brainwashed enough people now where people are saying, oh, we don't need free speech anymore because if you disagree with me, it's hate speech.
Yes, the free speech assaults are very concerning. And hate speech is definitely the Trojan horse that a lot of socialists, and not just them, they have plenty of support from across the political spectrum with like useful idiots both on the right and the left that play into their hands. That's why I think it's very dangerous when people use the word hate speech. It's such an ambiguous term and very malleable and can be used against anyone that dares to like dissent against the globalist culture that we're rapidly approaching towards. And it's definitely a cornerstone of Western civilization, because if you can't voice your opinion freely, you're essentially defenseless. And ideas and words can topple governments, and would-be authoritarians recognize that. That's why they not only just take your guns, they try to muzzle you as well.
Exactly. I mean, Venezuela is a disaster at this point. There's long lines to get out of the country. You have Brazil and Colombia now defending the borders, right? Because they can't let any more Venezuelans in.
Yes, that's correct. It's one of the biggest exodus in recent memory, and it's going to only continue to grow. But I think that Venezuela is a very important case that we make. That this is like this is the poster child of socialist failure. So I think we have to really be careful in that we always have to put out the best arguments and be ready to defend things, even if it's unpopular or not. Because once we give up too much ground, it's game over. And Venezuela is the one case that I have like worked on to educate people on the fact that like this is what happens when you let like interventionism go wild. People can like downplay it, say, "Oh, it's culture, it's so and so oil prices, commodity prices drop," but it's more than just that. It's bad ideas that are put into political practice.
Yeah, Real Vision Television, for our listeners who are subscribers there, has a couple documentaries out in Venezuela recently in the last like 6 to 8 months. And Venezuela should be a rich country, Jose. They have really good agriculture. They have good weather. They should have good tourism. They have mining there if they allowed foreign private sector investment. They have oil and gas. They have the ability here to have, they used to have like really good infrastructure and a well-educated population. There used to be a lot of very talented Venezuelan oil workers there. But from what I've heard, my contacts, a lot of them went to Colombia or came here to the United States.
Yes, there's a lot of talent in Venezuela. Colombia, Panama, United States, Spain. You also have a good deal of Venezuelans of Portuguese and Italian descent that took advantage of their grandparents' citizenship to go back to those countries. But the Venezuelan exodus tends to be among the most educated and skilled. So a lot of the countries that they go to are definitely gaining a lot in terms of human capital in the petroleum engineering and computer science sectors. It's a tragedy, but a lot of people just can't cope with a system where the currency is basically less than monopoly money. You can't even buy basic goods, and it looks more like a Mad Max scene day by day.
Yeah, Caracas now is the murder capital of the world. I saw a short video when Jeff Berwick, a dollar vigilante, and Luke Rudkowski from We Are Change went to Caracas. And so they were literally running when they left their hotel. Like their hotel was barricaded because the security guards, I don't think, were allowed to have guns because guns were banned. But the criminals and murderers all had weapons. But the people were trying to live by the laws. The rules were changing constantly. There was wage and price controls there. Inflation is running rampant. People broke into a zoo, I think, to kill and then eat zoo animals. People are murdering each other for sacks of flour or even for dollar bills. I've heard there were news stories of people routinely flying into the Caracas airport, and because people suspected they had foreign currency, they were killed. So it's getting to the breaking point here. But meanwhile, you have the people in the ivory tower there. You have Maduro, you have Chavez's family, his daughter, who are super rich. They've bought real estate all over the world. They were smuggling money. They bought all these luxury homes in Miami. I mean, there's stories about this all over the internet now of their decadence.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about these systems like socialism is that there's always going to be a ruling class. There's always going to be a really like privileged, ironically, sect of the population that takes advantage of all these laws and arbitrary regulations to enrich themselves at the expense of the entire populace. And yeah, Hugo Chavez's daughter struck it rich by exploiting a ton of government contracts, effectively like stealing the wealth through the state-owned oil. Because I tell a lot of Venezuelans as well that the whole purpose of keeping the oil sector away from the state is to prevent like future lunatics like say Hugo Chavez or his daughter from just raiding those accounts. That's why you want a separation of economy and state like completely. so that it makes it harder for the government to actually expropriate properties and take advantage of certain revenue streams. But yeah, like the ivory tower people, they're just living in a different world. They're going to downplay it. They're going to ignore it. That's what they've been taught. That's the programming they've accepted. And I don't expect them to really change their ways until we are able to create enough pressure from below and change the overall political discussion.
Yeah, the oil company is very close to collapsing. In some of those documentaries I mentioned, they were talking about how the oil is subsidized for Venezuelan citizens, and so that they don't. There's strikes if there's price increases on oil, but the oil is it's not at normal market prices that Americans may be familiar with for oil. Venezuelans are paying, I think, 40 cents a gallon, some tiny amount, but there's huge protests if they try to increase the oil price there in Venezuela to the citizens. Meanwhile, you have the military, which is allowed to do like this corrupt manipulation arbitrage. They can buy tankers of this oil. They're allowed to do this, like generals and other high-ranking people in the military, and then drive a tanker of cheap oil that they got almost for free, drive it across the border, and sell it for full price. And I think they're saying to do that. The corrupt government told them to try to, we were discussing before about how, one of the ways a corrupt government can protect itself is to take care of the military. So if you don't take care of the military will do the coup, right? So they're trying to bribe off the military, but the military is not using the money that they're stealing and arbitraging by selling the oil on the open market in other countries. They're not using it to fund the military properly. Instead, what they're doing is the leaders in the military are stealing the money for themselves and putting it in their own pocket. Meanwhile, you have the regular military soldiers, right? And I think, one part of their payment is that they're getting paid in toilet paper now. It's insane. Some of the stories I've heard out of Venezuela with, people eating rats and, there's tons and tons of stories. It's just insane.
Yes, that's correct. Historically speaking, a lot of governments they will give certain privileged um, actors, like say, like the military bureaucrats and other people in the government retinue, certain access and benefits in order to consolidate their power. It's Machiavellian politics 101, but it eventually will come to bite some of the lower figures. Like there's like cases even of like the Venezuelan military, especially like in outposts like in western Venezuela bordering Colombia, where they're practically starving, and don't have like any supplies, and there have been like failed mutinies that don't get really reported on, but there's definitely unrest brewing there, and I think that could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, in terms of like what could topple the Venezuelan government is if enough of these lower level military officials like revolt and mutiny against their commanders and the government. It could possibly topple the Maduro government altogether.
And the mainstream media doesn't report on in the United States on this either, how basically all political opposition, the leaders that become, the populist uprising of the people who are arguing against Maduro and before Chavez, how basically a lot of them were kidnapped and murdered. So because a lot of American and European journalists, and I'm using air quotes, a lot of them are hardcore leftists. A lot of them are actually, some of them, not a lot of them, but some of them are actually like can quote Marx chapter and verse. They are in favor of the ideology, so they actually don't report what's really going on in the ground with the people who are trying to, counter this corrupt government.
Yeah, legacy journalism is practically dead. The good news is there's a lot of alternative media that has emerged to compete with legacy outlets, but I just think that traditional news media is just not very good when it comes to reporting these events. And if they do report it, they report like the really like the shock jock type of content of like the long lines and like the empty store shelves, which is good, like at least good.
Did they try to blame capitalism?
Yeah,
Did they try to
or
blame
they give some
capitalism for the long
really
line?
weak sauce interpretation of the events, and that's where people like me have come in to say, like, look, we've got to break this down. It's much more than just like low oil prices or whatever buzzword is in vogue these days, like corruption, mismanagement, or whatever.
I saw the DC premiere of the Mike Cernovich documentary called Hoax. Stefan Molyneux and a bunch of other people, our listeners and you would know, were in there, and they were talking about the mainstream media, how the mainstream media like obfuscates and hides all the screw ups and murders and stuff like that for socialist governments because they're in favor of them in general. And they were showing the coverage from NBC News of the South Korean Olympics, and NBC News, like Brian Gumbel or one of those guys, was actually allowed to cross the border to North Korea, and they showed like a Potemkin village type of ski resort, and they tried to play it off showing how like, look, all these North Koreans are doing nicely, they have a nice ski resort, see how happy they are. It was just like, does anyone actually believe this stuff who actually understands what's really going on? I mean, there was mainstream financial media guy, I think he won a Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times, and he was fooled by the the Soviet government for a Potemkin village, and he still kept his Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, I believe that's Walter Duranty, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah,
You got it.
yeah. And it's this playbook has not changed. That's the crazy part, because this guy was doing that like in the 20s, late 20s and 1930s. So yeah, the scripts have not changed at all. Like none of this is really new when you actually like study history and observe all these trends. Yeah, Cernovich is great. I've been following his content for years. It's been good to see him like morph into like arguably America's like fiercest journalist, and he's so hated by the establishment because he takes everyone to task, and like the guy is like a true journalist despite not having like the background when he was like in the university. But we need more people like him because frankly, the legacy outlets and all of those institutions, they leave a lot to be desired, and many of them are just blatantly appendages of globalist interest groups, of socialist interest groups, and they just do not care to report facts anymore.
And the Hoax documentary, I think, will be available for everyone to see out in public, I think, in the next month. The film was about 2.5 hours long. It was very entertaining, though, very informative. When I saw it last Thursday, not yesterday, when we were recording this on Friday, December 14th, but a little over a week ago. And I think there's also a corresponding book with in-depth stuff because they interviewed some of the guests for many hours and they could only put some of the stuff into the film. But as we close up here, Jose, your last thoughts on Venezuela. So basically, people are always looking for investing opportunities. I know there's like hedge fund managers like suing the Venezuelan government over bonds and stuff like that. I would stay away from Venezuela. We have to see what this government collapse, this corrupt government collapse. We have to see private property rights. We have to see rule of law. We have to see certain things in place first before there's economic opportunity again in Venezuela, right?
Yeah, that's what I believe. I'm not well versed in investments and in that areas, but I think like for general purposes, it's just not a really safe country to put your money in. Expropriations can come anytime. The currency is practically worthless. A lot of talented workers are leaving the country. There's just like a dearth of like skilled workers there, and there's just so much institutional uncertainty. I would stay away. I would say as far away as possible if you were considering investing there.
Yeah, I'm staying away. I'm watching the situation. I mean, it's just so sad, and I hear so many apologists who are socialists say, this was capitalism's fault. This isn't real socialism. I'm just tired of hearing this, and it's repeated like 10 times a day by the same group of people.
Yeah, it's a tired play. People were saying that about the Soviet Union, that it wasn't real socialism. People said that about Cuba. People said that about North Korea, and now people are saying that about Venezuela. It's sad, but it's kind of our generation's struggle to point out that this is socialism, and we must fight against it because it's an evil system that wrecks people's lives, destroys people's wealth, and basically brings us back to our more savage ways.
And unfortunately, a lot of Americans are so either uninformed or brainwashed nowadays that in surveys, the surveys are saying, especially in our generation, Jose, either kids in college or kids right out of college, either millennials or I think the new generation, the younger adults is Generation Z. But that generation, they prefer socialism. But we have to challenge them, not with violence or anything, but we have to well, what's your definition of capitalism? And we have to try to correct them, because I can almost guarantee you that their preconceived notions of what they think the world is almost entirely wrong.
Indeed. It's becoming very clear that a lot of people live in their own worlds now, due to how insulated they are because of their media overlords and the people they follow on social media, that they just get like a completely skewed perspective, and it's just reinforced in the schools, the general culture, the politicians they follow. And it becomes very ingrained, and it's hard to beat because old habits die hard. But I am.
And you have bread and circus, Jose, and then you have these celebrities, right, either in Hollywood or music or movies, television, that are making millions of dollars a year, right, off of relatively free markets, a capitalism type of system where they have the ability to choose what job they want. And yet, despite them making all this money and starting businesses now, a lot of these Hollywood celebrities are capitalists. They own businesses and stuff. They bash capitalism relentlessly. Some of them used to go visit Hugo Chavez. So it's total double standards and total hypocrisy. And unfortunately, not enough people are calling them out on it.
It's the truth, Jason. It's a sad situation. I am optimistic though, because of a lot of technological improvements in social media, that we can spread this message and counter a lot of this disinformation. It's just a matter of a lot of the messengers just constantly improving and finding ways to become more effective messengers and reach out to bigger audiences. But until then, we've got work to do.
Agreed. And you're doing your part, man. You're writing articles about what's going on in Venezuela and keeping people informed. I just saw you got on NRA TV with Dana Loesch. So you're a rising star in our space.
Thank you.
So if our listeners want to follow your articles, I think you also cover important Second Amendment issues, because this fits in with the narrative there, right? Eliminate the main parts of the Constitution, right? Second Amendment, freedom of speech. The big technology companies are invasive of our privacy, all those different things. So they're systematically wiping the most important parts of being an American away.
Yep. I do cover a lot of topics, especially Second Amendment, for Mises.org, and as you mentioned, Gunpowder Magazine. And I've been on NRA TV. The best place to reach me at, though, is probably Twitter at Jose Al Nino. I'm also on Facebook, Jose Alberto Nino. If you send me a friend request, I'll accept it. Yeah, I will be making some big announcements in the next few weeks, so stay tuned if you follow me on Twitter. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Jason.
Yeah, you have a book, so I don't want to rush you or anything, but you are working on a book, right, about Venezuela and some of the things that are going on and some of the misperceptions that we talked about in this interview, right?
It's a rather tentative project. I do still do some articles on Venezuela. That being said, I do have an ebook that will be coming out in the next month that will deal with specifically gun control, but I will have some Venezuela content out as well. But for the time being, I'm mostly focusing on domestic issues.
Yeah, I think the U.S. can still be at least saved a little bit. I mean, some of these other countries, it's going to get much worse, and they're on the brink of collapse. I mean, I hope I'm wrong about this, Jose, but the cultural Marxists, as you described, have been so effective now for so long, and things are accelerating with the violence and escalation of things that it looks like the U.S. is headed towards an ideological civil war. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this already boil over in Europe. Whether it's, the protests for the last month in France, it wasn't just the gas tax increases were like the last straw, because people, their costs were going up with inflation. They couldn't pay their bills. Their rent was being hiked. They're just fed up with the elites in power. So, it's hopefully, I think the US, more people can be woken up, and hopefully I'm wrong and there's not an ideological civil war, but it looks like that's the way things are headed.
Yeah, hopefully things turn out for the better, but until then, we just have to keep trucking along.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the near future.
Likewise, Jason.
Please like this video, share it with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the Wall Street for Main Street YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Thanks for helping Wall Street for Main Street pass the 20,000 YouTube channel subscriber milestone despite YouTube censorship. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to 30,000 or even 40,000 YouTube channel subscribers quickly if YouTube doesn't shut down this channel. If YouTube does shut down this channel, remember to also sign up for the Wall Street for Main Street email list that's on the wallstreetformainstreet.com website and will tell you where the videos are going to be uploaded instead of YouTube. Also, if you really like the content and you decide that you want to give a one-time donation, you can go to the wallstreetformainstreet.com website where there's different options for you to do so. Or you can become a Patreon contributor. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to providing my loyal listeners with some of the best information, analysis, and financial education available out there, free or paid, as I work to grow the podcast and also get my educational technology company funded.